Deeper into dreaming. Every morning, Doña Silvia would ask, "What did you dream last night?" At first, I thought she was having an informal chat, so I would reply with a string of inconsequential topics I thought I had dreamt of or that I had made up on the spot. On one occasion, she gestured with her hand to stop my tirade and said, "To fall asleep is to give in to unconsciousness, so a warrior never sleeps. Awake, he is aware of himself. As he dozes off, he enters dreaming. A warrior never surrenders control." She took every opportunity to point out the importance of the practice of dreaming. Aware of the difficulties I was having with some of the topics of my healing training, one day she said, "A warrior knows that the odds are stacked against him, but that does not discourage him. On the contrary, he gathers all his courage and joyfully throws himself into the battle because he knows he is fighting for his freedom." If you want solutions for your worries, formulate the problem in your mind before going to sleep and let the solution present itself of its own accord. Our dreaming body knows things we cannot even imagine. On one occasion, she told me about one of the basic requirements of dreaming. She said, "Eating habits can greatly influence one's capacity for entering dreaming, especially in novices. Whenever you eat after 6 in the evening, it actually interferes with the transition to dreaming. So it is best not to eat anything before going to bed." One evening, to help with my nightmares, Doña Silvia pointed at my bed and said, "Go to sleep now," announcing that she too was about to retire to her quarters and lie down. Living with the sorcerers, I noticed that even couples never slept together in the same bed. They said it would interfere with their luminous fibers, and consequently with their dreaming. They claimed that sleeping and dreaming next to each other made it difficult for them to reach energetic balance. Following her command, I went to bed. It was still quite early, but since I had just been working hard hauling stones, I had no difficulty going to sleep. In my dream, I saw Doña Silvia standing beside me. We were in the Zocola in Mexico City. That was the first time I had gone into dreaming consciously, although it was with her help. In this dream, we entered the cathedral, which was strangely empty. I had the peculiar feeling of déjà vu, of having been there before. Doña Silvia guided me all the time. If it had not been for the pressure of her hand holding on to my arm, I would probably have left her and allowed myself to be pulled in by one of the many vortexes I saw forming everywhere. On that occasion, she also showed me the elasticity of the other world. It was as if the thought of an object or a place she suggested pulled us, sometimes abruptly, and that the object or the place immediately appeared. Upon awakening after each session with Doña Silvia, I knew I had been dreaming with her, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not remember the dreaming events. It took years before I could recover those memories. In that sense, dreaming and stalking are similar, since both lead to the second attention. And in both cases, a novice cannot readily remember the events that have taken place there. On waking up, for example, an apprentice almost immediately forgets what he has been dreaming while asleep, as if layers of fog have hidden the dreaming events from the conscious mind, even though they happened just a moment before. In the case of stalking, the situation is even worse, because one immediately forgets what one was doing and suddenly finds oneself standing somewhere without a clue of how one got there, and that is disconcerting. I remember spending years in a kind of lethargy, not knowing what was really happening to me. At one point, I came to believe I was suffering from amnesia or some other memory problem, whilst on another level of awareness, I knew very well what was going on. What helped me to lose the plot was the trust I had in Doña Silvia and the powerful feeling that I was finally involved in something extraordinary. During my first attempts at dreaming, I would invariably let myself be pulled in by torrents of visions that appeared like a whirlwind before me. It was like sinking into a film projection, and from that, one into another one, and another, and on until I woke up. Following Doña Silvia's instructions, however, I learned to keep my awareness fixed for longer periods before being pulled in to the next dream. To galvanize my attention, she suggested that I watch the flame of a candle every night without distraction. She said I should increase the length of the exercise, keeping my gaze on the flame from the moment it was lit until it was extinguished. With her help and the help of the other healers, I prepared a net to catch my dreaming. Following their advice, I drew upon everything I could to reach my goal. I wore my nightcap and my dreaming band. I made a belt to hold pebbles in place on my umbilical region. To help with the task, I placed a multitude of amulets strategically by the head of my bed. As a very special dreaming aid, I made a sheepskin sleeping bag with the fur inside and dedicated it exclusively to my dreaming practice. During one period, I spent all the time I could inside it. With actions like these, one becomes available to the intent of entering the other world. Doña Silvia also taught me that the body position one adopted before entering dreaming was very important. She said that in the beginning, it was preferable to make the attempt from sitting position, and only after achieving a certain degree of control could one start from any position, even lying down. She said, an experienced sorcerer can enter dreaming while awake, starting straight from his daily awareness, and that is how one creates a double. I asked her how that was done. She replied, when you close your eyes, beyond the images projected by your brain, you can see a point of light that is sometimes very clear and sometimes it isn't. If one can place one's attention on this point, one can perceive the world of dreaming even when awake. With experience, it is possible to enter that other world without having to go through the transition phase of going to bed and falling asleep. That is the rudiment of the technique used by sorcerers to enter dreaming while awake. To help me get into dreaming, Doña Silvia also made me align my bed with personal direction. She said we all had a beneficial cardinal direction that kept us in good form. I arranged my bedroll so that it was facing my good direction. On another occasion, she said, if we wish, we can recall our ordinary dreams. Children usually don't have a problem doing that. Remembering dreams is the first real step towards deliberate control of dreaming. That is why one must pay close attention to any recurring dreams one might have. I also remember my horror when Doña Silvia said I should deliberately seek my nightmares. Luckily, she first helped me understand and accept the reasons for my bad dreams, until one fine day, I found that I was simply no longer afraid of my night visions. Instead, when they occurred, I would watch them without emotion, feeling only a strange sensation that I was forgetting something important I ought to be doing. One day, when I was finally able to deploy enough energy, I remembered myself in my dream. I discovered that dreaming was the same as the ordinary dreams we all had, only this time it was controlled. Little by little, I gained confidence and began to explore the world of dreaming by myself. My night forays were mostly brief. I did not venture far beyond the familiar ground. As I entered dreaming, I typically stayed within visions which I'd had before. But in one dream, I began chasing a firefly which resembled a luminous dandelion. I don't know how long the pursuit had been going on when I realized that I was lost in that other world. Because of Doña Silvia's repeated warnings, getting lost in dreaming was the greatest of my fears. The spot of light seemed to understand my problem. because it held back and hovered so close that I could see it in detail. Its brightness suddenly became more intense. It seemed to inflate, stretching and convulsing for a moment until it expanded into the diffused image of a human being. I could not tell if what I saw was a boy or a girl. The being spoke to me without using its mouth. I felt its voice within me. I thought I had heard it say, "Why did you stop?" That was the first time that I had met an aware entity during my adventures on the other side. I was astonished. The feeling of surprise made my rational mind pick up the reins, and I started waking up in my bed. I immediately used Doña Silvia's techniques of returning to a particular dreaming vision and went back to sleep. When I managed to return to dreaming, the human image was gone, but I could still see the speck of light. The context, too, had changed, and we were now in one of the places of power the sorcerers used to take me to. In that place, I had more self-confidence. I made a conscious effort to project a thought to the luminous being. A thought that said, "I'm afraid of getting lost in this world." The light responded in the same way. "Fear not, I'll guide you." That encounter was the start of a friendship. I became used to meeting up with Blore, my friend from dreaming. I called the being Blore because that was the feeling I had in its presence. Blore. In subsequent meetings, I learned that Blore was a female dreamer from another world who had ties to a group of healers. In fact, I found out that it was Doña Silvia who had asked Blore to help me move around in that other world, and it had worked. Apart from learning to move around in that world, I learned many other things from Blore. In one of our meetings, she taught me a maneuver of passing unnoticed in that environment. Blore called the technique the invisibility cloak, claiming it was essential for survival in that world. She showed me how to build a kind of igloo made of energy, where I could hide very well. She made me turn my attention to certain properties. Some of Eagle's emanations had and showed me how that special type of energy responded more readily to attempts to mold them. I did as I was shown, and I could see that the energy actually followed my command. Using the will, one heaps up energy as if building a haystack. To understand this, one must take into consideration that the texture of the world on the other side is very malleable, and that will can be used to move quantities of emanations from one spot to another, so that, having made a heap of light fibers inside which it is possible to hide, one can actually remain unnoticed by the countless entities marauding through that place, many of whom are not really friendly. Another emergency technique Blore taught me was to curl up on myself like a fetus, but without lying down. That movement can be used if one needs to escape the many violent predators inhabiting these regions. They are known to the sorcerers as marauders. I am infinitely grateful to Blore for sharing the knowledge that is so useful over there in that other place. One of the greatest delights for sorcerer dreamers is making contact with creatures from other worlds. Those beings usually come from the neighboring world, but occasionally one may contact entities from more distant regions. It is known that the farther away they come from, the greater the risk that they might be hostile. I was able to corroborate that these explorers from distant worlds are indeed frightening. They are brightly colored and give the feeling of being under unbearable pressure, seemingly on the verge of exploding. Blore once took me to see her world. The beings that inhabit it are not at all like us. They are not even solid like we are, but resemble a kind of jelly. And the world they live in has the same characteristics, or at least that is how I perceived it. I saw that the concepts of male and female were valid in that world, just like in ours. Beings there engaged without any inhibition in what we call sexual acts. It is natural for them to be connected all the time. Blore told me that in her world, she felt isolated from her fellows, finding it hard to carry out her normal role within the society in which she lived. It struck me that Blore's fate in her world was paralleled to that of Carlos Castaneda's here on Earth. Her world is similar to ours insofar as, because of the predators, no one there believes in the possibility of dreaming. That is truly a great pity. As so few individuals of either of our species are aware of their immense possibilities, and consequently on both sides, ridicule those who speak of the subject. I have not seen Blore for years. The last time I saw her, she took her leave of me and told me that she was about to set off on a very dangerous journey. She intended to cross a part of the dreaming world controlled by very fierce, inorganic beings. I tried to dissuade her from that adventure, but she had confidence in her ability to hide, and so set off on her journey. I've had no further news of her since. She may have achieved her objective, or she may have become prisoner of the marauders. From the Dreaming Log. On one occasion, Doña Silvia asked me, "How are you getting on with your dreaming?" I answered that I was carefully recording every dream I had. She laughed and said it was good to do that. I added that keeping a written record of my dreams had initially helped me remember more easily to find my hands. At one point, the subject of dreaming became so important to me that I tackled it with true passion. I considered it a legitimate field for personal investigation. Even before going through the first gate of dreaming, I had discovered that writing down experiences, common dreams as well as nightmares, dissipated the large part of one's obsessions and morbidity. In my case, dreaming became much easier as I advanced in the exercise of recapitulation. My instructors would often repeat, "For warriors, recapitulation is not an option, it is mandatory." That morning I was helping Doña Silvia shell corn off the dried cobs. I had to wear hide gloves to protect my hands from injury. As we worked, she said I was ready for a new phase of training. With great seriousness, but without formality, she said, "It's about a new maneuver to be performed in the world of dreaming. You've learned to reach the other world, and you've managed to keep pretty good control of yourself. So now it's time to embark on a new task. Go and recapitulate in dreaming." That aspect of the recapitulation was new to me. I had never considered using dreaming to recapitulate. I laid my gloves aside and jotted down her words. If you practice recapitulation and dreaming in parallel, you'll notice that with time, what you experience in either of them will seem more and more alike to you. One reinforces the other, until eventually there is no difference whatsoever between them. Recapitulating in dreaming is one of the most rewarding tasks for an apprentice. What makes this task so special is that not only do you remember an event, you totally and completely relive it. I committed to the task. It was hard work at first, but when I chose beforehand what I wanted to recapitulate, things changed. I would enter the pre-programmed scene in my dreaming. I was impressed with the vividness of detail, and my visions were shaped by things I had no idea I had witnessed. Once our life experience has passed through the filter of recapitulation again and again, details such as modes of behavior, gestures, and anecdotes emerge, and we end up realizing we had not been experiencing life as fully as we thought we had. We become aware that behind everything we witness, there is always more going on. Perceptions of events which seemingly have not happened. They have, though, but in different states of awareness. As one progresses with this exercise, one ends up recapitulating not just the world of daily affairs, but also the dreams one's ever had. It is a magical activity that happens of its own accord and ends in the joining of the dreaming body and the physical body. A warrior who has reached this level has no need to go to bed and sleep in order to dream. He can do it awake. Part 4. The Secret of the Plumed Serpent. On the Path of the Gods. From the very start of my stay with the healers, I speculated that they might be part of an original religious sect. They seemed to have their own fraternity. I had the impression that I had got involved with practicing Catholics who were very serious about their worship. If they had not put so much stress on healing, they could have been easily mistaken for Capuchin friars, I thought. All they were short of was the habit. In Doña Silvia's house, there was an altar covered in images of her protecting saints. It was the healer's custom to pray to the novenas of the rosary there. They also regularly attended Mass and frequented religious festivals. We even went to celebrations in other towns. Although I did not much care for that kind of thing, I saw their behavior as normal, because at the time I was conditioned to perceive them as very devout people. The healers were very friendly with Father Ignacio Rojas, a very nice man of short stature. The best thing about whom was that he seemed to look kindly at the healers, and occasionally even sent them patients for consultation. In return, Doña Silvia and other women of the group, who presented themselves as relatives, regularly took part in cleaning and maintenance of the chapel. On one occasion, the healers told me they had joined a party of pilgrims from the parish and wanted me to accompany them on a march. I replied that although I was feeling much better, I still hadn't fully recovered. They said that if I wanted to be with them, I had to get used to their customs. There is a saying among the sorcerers that nothing is free, and that if one wants to learn, one needs to get one's hands dirty. I half-heartedly continued taking part in religious events, as the healers did not give me an option. Occasionally, I felt like a rebellious child, being dragged every Sunday to Mass. Whenever I accompanied them on a pilgrimage, they directed my attention principally at the Christian aspect of the event. So much so that it took me a long time to realize what was really going on during those festivities. At that time, even as I witnessed many traditional rituals, I was always under the impression that they were variations accepted by the Catholic Church. On one occasion, however, we walked to a festival in another town. After the arduous march, the ceremony took place. I noticed that apart from Christian ones, certain other rituals were performed, different from the usual repertoire and belonging to the ancient culture. I doubted very much that those practices had been sanctioned by the church. From that moment on, I started suspecting that something strange was going on. The long prayers and vigils were sometimes very tiring. As I took part in the pilgrimages, it did not take me long to discover that behind the Catholic facade, the participants were harboring a powerful strain of pre-Hispanic culture. I could see how their practices were flavored by ancestral elements, and not just in the way they invoked the four directions or purified the assistants with copal incense. I also established that their prayers varied. In Castilian, they prayed to a Christian saint, and in the ancient language, the prayer was directed at their gods. Even at the beginning, when they presented their activities to me as folk traditions, it was easy to notice the autochthonous tendency of the group. Their garments and ceremonies had the colors and the flavor of the past. On those occasions, without any real engagement, I learned a large number of songs and prayers in both languages, even though at the time I did not fully understand the meaning of the words I was repeating. While assimilating their songs and listening to their stories, I began to understand the significance they gave to the elements that constituted their world. To learn about each of them, in effect, created a new world of description for me, one in which the value of things was not the same as in the world I came from. When I asked Don Melcher about the religious mumbo-jumbo, he answered that things were exactly as they had to be. He seemed to have said all he wanted to say with that reply, so I did not insist any further. A few days later, however, he himself reopened the topic. He began by saying that the Concheros' war with religion was still not finished, and that every year they performed the same dances in front of churches as a reminder that, even though they had robbed the Indian of his lands, the invaders had not yet succeeded in controlling his spirit. The outcome of the battle was thus still undecided, and the war was continuing. He said, due to the rigors of the period, at the time of the conquest, the survivors allied with the Catholic Church, and by that act most likely saved thousands of lives. It was the Church that gave Indians refuge from the indiscriminate slaughter by the conquistadors. The reason why our ancestors decided to pursue that strategy was because it had been their custom to flow with the energy for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years, and they were not willing to abandon their traditions that easily. They adopted religion, then, as a way of carrying on with their customs, and passed it on to us. But it doesn't hinder our practices at all. On the contrary, it complements them. I commented, I thought it was the other way around. I believed that by joining religion, the Indians lost their roots. Not at all, Don Melcher said. The evidence that their strategy was successful is that even today, you can see dancers at every religious festival in Mexico. Does that mean that all those dancers are sorcerers? I asked. He shook his head slowly with an air of sadness and replied, No, that's not what I wanted to say. Unfortunately, almost all the ones I know have lost the way and know very little of what they're talking about. There are, however, some who have kept the knowledge intact. The truth is that the majority of them don't even know why they do what they do when they get together at a fiesta. That's not important at all, though, because what they are doing is giving continuity to the ancient tradition of the way of the Holy Cross, which in reality is the way of energy. Today, the majority of people have forgotten the original purpose. Each time there's fewer of us who know why we go on pilgrimages and why we meet in those particular places. At present, there's only us few and some Huicholes brothers. Continuing with his explanation, he said, at the time of the conquest, the Tlatoanes found ways of convincing the priests to construct their churches and Christian monuments in the exact places where, according to their custom, the energy descended at a certain time of the year. Christian priests were impressed by the demonstrations of faith and pity of the natives who constructed chapels to honor obscure saints extracted from the canonical list of the church. The saints, not even they, the priests knew existed. That was the strategy of those sorcerer stalkers, known in their times as the cunning ones or the trappers. That is how they managed to continue their practices unmolested. With the invasion, they had to disguise their practices in order to carry on with them. That is why they adopted Christianity not as a religion, but as a way of continuing with their traditions. The only thing that really mattered to those sorcerers who followed the flow of the energy was that the selected place coincided with the right date, so they renamed each of their gods. How did they rename them? They replaced them by the corresponding names of saints from the Catholic calendar. They represented Quetzalcoatl, for example, as Saint James the Apostle, and the goddess Coatlicue as the Virgin Mary. Tezcatlipoca became our Lord of Chalma, and so on. In that way, without anyone objecting, they swapped the names of their deities to that of any saint or holy person whose feast coincided with the day, when, in accordance with the ancient calendar, the energy would concentrate on that spot. To all appearances, they had left their ancient gods for the new ones. But we of the tradition, we all know that only the names have changed. Occasionally, as part of the group's religious practice, we would go on a pilgrimage to the nearby shrines. Sometimes to settlements so isolated it took days to get there. During such fiestas, it was customary for the participants to engage in extensive cultural interaction. They would exchange herbs and recipes, and in their conversations discuss patient histories and how they managed to heal them. We would usually receive an invitation to lodge at the house of one of the villagers for the duration of the festival, and would be treated by them as family. On such festive occasions, apart from visiting the Christian churches, Don Melcher would also take us to visit the ceremonial centers of the ancients. In that fashion, we visited, I believe, all the archaeological sites and pyramids of Mexico. Once we had to walk for 2 days to get to a humble altar in the middle of the desert. The shrine was no more than a pile of stones, very far from any road or settlement. In spite of its isolated position, when we got there, the place was teeming with people, and the shrine was covered in gifts. Whispering, I asked Don Melcher why the ancients had constructed a shrine in the middle of nothing. Because energy concentrates here, he answered in a very low voice. What's the story with the places where energy concentrates? He gave me a sign to be silent. When the ceremony was over, we sat down on some stones, and then he answered my question. You need to know that the sorcerers of antiquity discovered that from time to time, the lines of the world cross and form vortexes of energy. They saw that the vortexes came in cycles, which recurred year after year. For that reason, they made a map specifying where and when those concentrations of energy took place. Their knowledge lies behind the ancient system of pilgrimages that endures to this day. Pilgrimages along the sacred routes were walks to places of power, in the past as they are today. Fragments of that ancient custom persist up to this day among the Mexican people who unknowingly make the same journeys the ancients have done. Those that go to Teotihuacan or to Chichen Itza year after year, for example, basically continue with the tradition of the ancient energy trackers. I had to admit that even when I used to hate going on pilgrimages, I always felt optimistic, content, and strong in the actual places of worship. With Don Melcher's explanation, I was able to understand why. The flight of the Quetzal. I like to accompany Doña Silvia on her walks to the surrounding fields to gather wild flowers, insects, and medicinal herbs. Once, while we were walking through the valleys to the south of the house in search of some plants to prepare a remedy, we witnessed the flight of a Quetzal, the bird sacred to the ancients. The Quetzal was supposed to be extinct in those places. Its long tail and the undulating flight reinforced the impression of a flying snake. I pointed at it and was about to say something about the spectacle that we had just seen, but Doña Silvia did not allow me to comment. She put her index finger on her lips to indicate that I must be silent. Later, in a reverent voice, she said I ought to be grateful for my good fortune. I tried to guess what she was referring to, because I had several times in the past broken certain emotional bonds and had found it a bit painful. I believed that she was lecturing me on the advantages of being free, and that she was doing so because it is generally known that Quetzal does not breed in captivity. We returned to the house. Doña Silvia ordered me not to discuss what we had seen with anybody. The vision, she said, was a gift of power, and I should meditate on the experience. She said it was my personal task to preserve that memory for the rest of my life. I thought it was another one of her eccentricities. She must have spoken to the others about what had happened, since after a while I noticed a change in their behavior towards me. Some of them would have walked past me and never even looked at me before, now came to speak with me. One day, Don Melcher stopped repairing the hen house behind the main building and took me for a long walk in the mountains to an area I had not yet explored. When we got to the flat top of a medium-sized hill, almost completely boxed in by other larger hills, we sat down inside a stone circle that appeared to have been previously used as a meeting place. Don Melcher collected a few branches, placed them on a ring of smaller stones in the center of the circle, and said some words in his language. I could not help noticing the habit the healers had of kneeling down and offering the flame to the four directions before actually lighting the fire. With his chin, he indicated that I should sit at one of the far ends of the circle. He sat down next to me and placed his hat on top of the machete he had put by the stone he was sitting on. We remained silent for a long time. An undeniable feeling of peace and well-being pervaded that place. Breaking the silence, Don Melcher suddenly said, "Because of the omen you witnessed, I'm going to initiate you in the secret knowledge of the Plumed Serpent." Although I could clearly hear what he had said, I did not understand what he was referring to. He went on with his explanation. "The fact that the Quetzal has chosen you to witness its flight is a very important omen for us. It has been a long time since one of them was seen around here. It was a good omen, indicating to us that you have been chosen to receive the knowledge of our true religion." I stared at him with a questioning, surprised expression. After repeatedly witnessing tremendous acts of faith on their part for such a long time, I believed that the healers were indisputably the most fanatical Catholics I had ever known. I looked at him with incredulity, unable to guess what their true religion might be. "What then is your true religion?" I asked. "All of us belong to the circle of the Plumed Serpent," he answered, "even though we have our own point of view on it." I was surprised by the revelation and waited eagerly for him to begin telling me the secrets of his religion. But all of a sudden, he changed the subject. I protested, saying it wasn't fair that he should rouse my curiosity by announcing that he was going to tell me secrets and then change the course of the conversation. Don Melcher smiled and said, "We are definitely going to instruct you in the way of the serpent, but that cannot be done by talking, nor can it be achieved overnight. It is therefore necessary to have patience. And I'd better mention that patience is one of the prerequisites if one is to take part in the cult of Quetzalcoatl." This was the first time in my life I had heard anyone speak of the cult of the Plumed Serpent. I believed that that sort of thing had not been in existence for centuries. I told him what I had studied the subject at school, and that I knew quite a bit about it because I had investigated it as a topic of interest, but he did not allow me to go on speaking. "Forget everything that you have learned," he explained. "Most of what people know is corrupt. It has been manipulated by the conquistadors. It's not worth wasting your time on that rubbish." There are even stories that claim Quetzalcoatl was in fact Jesus Christ, who had come to proclaim the Jewish doctrine to our ancestors. They describe him as a blonde of beard and with blue eyes. "Do me a bloody favor." As he spoke, pretending to be annoyed, Don Melcher smiled. Then he added, "First of all, suspend your judgment and allow me to introduce you to the authentic knowledge of our ancestors. Wait until you know the secrets of the Plumed Serpent so that you can express an opinion of the subject." He was absolutely right. What I learned with them was as far as could be from everything that I knew or had heard about the subject. Following that event, it took almost 10 years for me to become fully integrated into the movement of the serpent. During that time, I continued with my normal work as the healer's assistant, so that as I developed in the faith, I had the opportunity to learn their skills and put my knowledge into practice. For me, the big change in my relationship with the healers happened after the Quetzal bird omen. After that, my feelings about the festivities changed completely, as I was allowed to participate in meetings that were forbidden to me earlier. During the years that followed, I was introduced to the knowledge step by step. Gradually, I was given explanations of the real meaning of the ceremonies, which were sometimes performed in plain view of everyone, but in such a surreptitious form that nobody had any idea what was really going on. I realized that in fact only very few of the healers belonged to the movement of the serpent. They were something like a secret society within another exclusive society. So much so that the majority of the people who took part in the ceremonies were not really aware of what was going on behind the curtains. They were merely the extras in the movie, so to speak. The events culminated for me during the festivities dedicated to San Jose, the patron saint of Tolan, the city now known as Tula. We performed our usual ceremonies there, and on the third night of vigil in that sacred place, we performed the rituals. We sang, danced, and took communion with the flesh of the Hikuri. At dawn, just as the sun came up, the leader of the ceremony made a series of gestures and prayed to the divinities of the four winds. He then began invoking the Plumed Serpent with such affection and tenderness in his voice that he seemed to be addressing his beloved. My eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but because I was flooded by a feeling of indescribable love. The leader said, "Nimitznatzlitawatlia inti amalipampa, nimitznatlatlatilia inti kihuatlampa, nimitznatlatlatilia inti Miklampa, Nimitznatlatatlia, Inti Talahitzlilampa, Nimitznatnatatalia, Inti Zuetekuhitli, Inti Tokiato, Inti Tonatsin Tlatli, Inti Tialoque, Ninotza Natlatzotla, Quetzalcoatl, Sahiquiki Tokinoloki, Tihuatzinitzin Mopitlitsin, Tinotza Tihunatsitzin, Tihoinextini. In Huehuetlatmatalitzli, in Kolatnotza, Talahuitzlataplanza cuti, Titichemaka mopetlakali, Titichetitia moye luhuayan. Translated, this meant, with the permission of the four directions, the four winds, with the permission of Grandfather Fire, with the permission of Grandmother Water, with the permission of our beloved Mother Earth, with the permission of the spirits of the air, we call on our well-beloved Tatawari Quetzalcoatl. Answer our call. It is us, your children, calling. We seek the knowledge of our ancestors. Show yourself, O Lord of Light. Teach us your secrets. Take us to your kingdom. As the leader spoke the incantation, the others emitted a very low murmur. I don't know if it was because of the physical exhaustion caused by fasting and the long vigil, but at a certain moment, their voices, which seemed to me a choir of angels, became a hypnotic vehicle that pulled me towards a kind of endless tunnel. Immediately and spontaneously, I entered a deep state of dreaming. The transition to dreaming was most unusual. It was the first time something like that ever happened to me. This time, I was able to follow the transition from normal awareness to the state of dreaming step by step. What I found most fascinating was the realization that all of us were already permanently there, but did not know it. I was suddenly within a circle of persons radiating light. I could see their luminous cocoons. At that moment, I was perfectly aware that I was dreaming. Noticing that I was in dreaming, I immediately tried to establish a point of reference. At the time, my dreaming attention was still fluctuated. At a certain moment, I perceived that my attention was flagging, but then we all joined hands and instantly felt a thrust of energy. I could perceive that the circle we were forming vibrated and radiated power. In that state of being, I could hear the others without their uttering a word. For a moment I wondered if they could hear my thoughts as I was able to hear theirs. One of them immediately answered me inside my head, saying that articulating words was not necessary in that dimension, and that it was much easier to simply think what one wanted to say to the others. I focused my attention on exploring my immediate environment. Depending on the way I focused on them, I could see the other participants in two different ways, as physical bodies or as luminous beings. The leader of the ceremony appeared to be wearing a kopili of extremely brilliant light on his head. At a certain moment, he performed some movements we all imitated. We began vibrating with ever-growing intensity. I immediately saw a great outburst of light shining down on us. It projected shadows of everything, including our physical bodies, which stood still on the side of the ceremony. The light intensified further, grew in size, and began describing circles as it floated above us. It appeared to gain solidity, and then a most vivid image of a Chinese dragon, of the type that can be seen during their festivals, formed before us. Suddenly my perception focused, and I knew without the shadow of a doubt that this was Quetzal, the Plumed Serpent. The same image that I had seen so many times represented in stone of the ancient monuments throughout the country. I was astonished. Even though I knew that I was dreaming, I did not expect to encounter something like that. The surprise was such that I woke up, only to establish that the glow was still there. If I brought it into focus, I could perceive the figure of the serpent floating above our heads. That loving light touched the deepest core of my being and taught me the real meaning of the path of the Plumed Serpent. What was taking place was a real gift of power for me, and I treasure it as one of my best monuments. It took me years to recover those memories, as well as some other ones, in order to understand better what had happened to me on that occasion. Even today, I keep adding pieces to the puzzle. But now, at least I can clarify, for those who know what I'm talking about, that the secret of the followers of the cult of Quetzal is a specific movement of the assemblage point. The lineage of the Tikis. In Doña Silvia's house, on the wall of the healing room, there hung a framed image of the spinal column labeled with well-known anatomical terminology. In addition, next to each vertebrae, there was an enigmatic corresponding handwritten inscription, giving its name in the native language. Those inscriptions were a kind of secret among the healers. Doña Silvia called the diagram the staircase to heaven, and said that it represented to the ranks of her lineage. Their meaning unexplained, the writings had become an unbearable mystery which made me bite my fingernails with curiosity. During my time as assistant, I was taught to regard the spinal column as the center of a person's health. In fact, my instruction in the art of healing was based on the 33 steps of health and well-being of the human being. According to the tradition of the Tikis, as they used to call the physicians of antiquity, the steps corresponded to the vertebrae, each of them with its own lessons and tests presented to the healer's assistant during their apprenticeship. I had to know and learn about each of them. First, they taught me their anatomy, as it is taught in schools. Years later, when I had sufficiently advanced in the cult of the Plumed Serpent, the secret teachings of the spinal column were revealed to me. Alluding to the drawing of the spinal column, Don Melcher once said that the Tikis used the scheme of the stairs to move the energy from one center to another, and that was the rule for them. According to Sears, we have 8 principal centers. The rule says one must start from the bottom, from the first center, pass on to the second, and carry on successively until one reaches the last of the steps. That is how one discovers seeing. The energy climbs up the spinal column, bang, bang, center by center, until one reaches the full potential that we as luminous beings are destined for. Where does the energy move to? Asked one of the assistants. As we have previously seen, Don Melcher replied, for human beings, only sexual energy exists. It can be wasted the way ordinary people waste it, or it can be accumulated and transmuted to other levels. The challenge is to transform that energy, moving it from one center to another until it has come around, full circle. That was the goal of the Tikis of antiquity. Not having achieved integration, they tried to make the energy come round, full circle, in pairs, which is the reason Tikis always come in pairs. How does one move energy from one place to another? I asked. By undergoing training in the way of the Tikis. Among other things, that training includes the exercise of visualization of the progress of energy from one center to another. Those steps can take years to complete, although cases are known of warriors whose centers opened very fast. It follows that for the believers, the intent of reaching the awareness of Quetzal, or the awareness of the Plumed Serpent, is, like I said before, a specialized movement of the assemblage point, where the warrior, by means of unbending intent, takes his assemblage point beyond the limits of the luminous egg. As he does that, the luminous egg stretches and turns into a thin line of light, with the assemblage point at one end, like the head of a rattlesnake. For an external observer, that vision resembles a luminous serpent floating in the sky. The serpent people, as they are sometimes called, were warriors who have carried out that maneuver. Alone, in a pair, or in group, they managed to stretch the luminous egg until it became a line of light. They are the sorcerers who have reached the level of the Plumed Serpent, and they eternally travel on the ocean of awareness as a community of explorers who were once human, like us. The goal of those warriors was to join their two extreme points, to bite their own tail and form a circle. But try as hard as they might, they never managed to attain their goal. However, new generations of seers arose, who, continuing with the tradition, hit upon the idea of trying to do it in pairs. In this particular sorcerer's intent, one bites the tail of the other, thus forming a huge circle of energy, an enormous assemblage point. This time they achieved their goal. The maneuver made it possible for the participants to raise their awareness to unthinkable levels. That is the great secret of the lineage of the Tikis. The lineage of the healers has, after a fashion, followed their ancestral tradition, although in a modified form, as they currently don't turn themselves into lines of light. They have, nevertheless, maintained the tradition of the circular form.